Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Check with your desk.
I want to ask the member what he thinks about the growing of marijuana in residential. The Senate has recommended that it would be up to the provinces to decide whether or not it would be legal to grow marijuana, recreational marijuana, 4 plants, which is actually 12 plants. And would he agree with the recommendation of the Senate that it be up to the provinces?
Honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Well, thank you, my honourable colleague, for the question. There's a couple of factual points I'd like to make. First of all, the legislation says that it would allow Canadians to grow up to 4 plants per household. He made a reference to 12 plants. I'm not sure where that comes from. Yes, we on this side of the House do believe that that is a reasonable and proper provision of this bill. It was the task force on cannabis and regulation headed by Anne McClellan that did an exhaustive examination of this issue and decided to recommend that Canadians should be able to grow 4 plants. As the member may know, under the Supreme Court of Canada's decision, Canadians have the constitutional right to grow medicinal cannabis. It would seem quite perverse if one house on a block could be able to grow cannabis legally because they're growing it for medicinal use, and the house beside them was not able to grow it simply because of the different purpose. I also would point out that every single jurisdiction in the United States, Washington, Colorado, Oregon, California this year, all permit the growing of marijuana in reasonable limits and with reasonable parameters around it. It's a sensible way. If you want to have legalization of cannabis in this country, you have to trust Canadians to be able to responsibly use cannabis and to grow plants like any other plant, as long as, of course, it's done responsibly and in a reasonable amount.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. About 23 hours or so ago, I wish you a good morning, so I take the chance to wish you a good evening. I want to talk about, first off, Madam Speaker, I'd like to say that I will be splitting my time with my colleague and honourable member from Vancouver Quadra. And I'd like to start off, before I give the formal part of my speech, by discussing an element that was brought up by the honourable member from Vancouver Queensway, who had spoken about a number of members of the Senate and others, as well as the Right Honourable John Turner, as to their potential financial interest in legalizing marijuana. And I understand that this is an issue of privilege. You can say what pleases you in this House, but I found it particularly unparliamentary that he would raise the record of someone who has served this country with distinction, with honour, in talking about the Right Honourable John Turner, who was among many positions he occupied as Prime Minister of Canada. He also was the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Justice. He's a man of some advanced age, I believe, and I'd like to take the chance to wish him a happy birthday. He turned 89 quite recently. And I know it on good authority that he has zero interest in the legalization of marijuana or any pecuniary derivative thereof, Madam Speaker. So I won't presume bad faith on the side of the honourable member, and I hope that when he gets a chance to retract those words that he does so, because we are in fact talking about a person who served this country honourably, regardless of party lines, and I do hope that he does take the chance to retract those comments. Madame la Présidente, c'est avec plaisir que je prends.
Madam Speaker, it's a pleasure for me to speak in the House to deal with an amendment adopted by the Senate with respect to Bill C-45. I'd like to congratulate the Senate for its very helpful work done on this legislation. Nevertheless, I believe some of the amendments would not allow us to meet the goals of the policy that inspires this legislation. I'd like to take the opportunity to emphasize Clause 5.2, which says it is understood that the present legislation will apply to all commercial provisions which prohibit the growing or harvesting of cannabis in a residence. It would allow residents to grow up to 5 plants. these plants could not be sold to another person, and whoever grew up to 4 plants or more than 4 plants would risk being faced with criminal accusations. The object of this provision has 2 components. First of all, the provision would be to counter the illegal market for cannabis, and second, it would contribute to preventing useless incriminations of Canadians who are growing cannabis and using it in a responsible way. Growing cannabis at home would be a legal source of cannabis to people who may not have access to an outlet for the sale of cannabis. This would allow a limited volume of cannabis for personal use to be similar to the provision that now exists for tobacco, for example. People can grow their own tobacco for their own consumption. And there are also Canadians who would maintain the cannabis and keep it in a safe place and use it only for their personal use. Following an investigation into cannabis, one of the questions the government asked was, where did people get their cannabis and where were they likely to have access to cannabis in the future? And all respondents, or most respondents, only 2% had thought of growing it themselves. So home cultivation of cannabis is compatible with the framework adopted by most American states which have legalized and regulated cannabis. These states have allowed home cultivation and allow people to grow up from 4 to 12 plants per residence. It's important to remember that Bill C-45 was developed to allow provinces and territories to authorize the distribution and sale of cannabis on their territory and to add additional restrictions that are not proposed in the Cannabis Act, in particular with respect to personal use. This flexibility would allow local priorities to be compatible with the government's concerns for health in the Cannabis Act. The Canadian government believes that provinces and territories are best placed to assess the necessity for regulating on their territory. Most provinces will allow for the personal cultivation of up to 4 plants, as provided for in C-45, but some provinces have decided to add restrictions. For example, New Brunswick, which will require that if cannabis is grown outside, there be a secure fence, and that this area be locked. In Nova Scotia, they have said that they would allow owners, building owners, to forbid people from growing or smoking cannabis in their buildings. There would be a tribunal that would examine the provincial regime, and it would be up to tribunals to decide whether there was a conflict with the federal legislation. Over the past 2 years, our government has held broad consultations, and so we are better equipped to move forward with this bill. Bill C-45 is based on the recommendations of the working group I mentioned and reflects experts' points of view, and this during our vast series of consultations. It balances various points of view, those of municipalities, provinces and territories, Indigenous governments, and a huge spectrum of experts. Provincial and territorial governments have their own legislation they are preparing to bring in systems to regulate. Bill C-45 would allow adults to grow up to 4 plants, and it would allow home growth in order to meet the government's objective, which is to replace the illegal market. This is in order to make sure that this activity will help, once again, to replace the illegal market. Home cultivation, in our opinion, helps in this approach. On the other hand, as you know, this bill contains a provision allowing for 7 provisions, rather, would deal with its coming into effect. When this happens, the minister will ensure that this will be reviewed later. So the government would then be ready to change the legislation, and it would make sure that the review looks into the growth of cannabis in residential buildings. Based on the proof we have now, on the testimony we have now, we believe that cannabis could be grown in a way that is compatible with concerns for health and security that are part of the legislation. People could use cannabis for their personally, and this is the approach adopted by the American states which have legalized cannabis. It is for all these reasons, Madam Speaker, that I will not support this amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My colleague from Surrey explained to me that where the 12 came from, and that it was you're allowed to have 4 mature plants, 4 immature plants, and 4 plants that were just being planted. So my question for the member opposite is that if you've got somebody with a prescription for marijuana and they're growing their 4 plants, and you have someone else in the household who does not have a prescription, does that mean they're allowed 8, which is really 24 plants? Because you're not supposed to share prescriptions with other people. And if there's another person in the house with a different prescription for medical marijuana, would they be allowed their 4 plants, which is really 12, and then there'd be 36 in the house? Just want to know how that's going to work. I think that multiplication is even right with Liberal gun registry math.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities.
So, Madam Speaker, far be it for me to give anyone math instructions, but the member should know and should well know that prescriptions are given on an individual basis and are not to be passed off. She should also know that on a medical basis, up to 30 grams are authorized. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.